Hi everyone. So for this video, we're going to talk about Faulkner and his short story, Rose for Emily. So William Faulkner was born in September 25, 1897, and lived until July 6, 1962. In 1949, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he's considered one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century. He has a lot of influence on writers of the late 20th century, a lot like Hemingway. And he also has a lot of influence on modern writers as well. He was born without the U in his name, the great grandson of Colonel William Clark Faulkner, who fought in the Civil War, built a local railway, and wrote and published The White Rose of Memphis. For some reason, he decided to add the U to his name, maybe to distinguish himself as a writer from his grandfather or great grandfather, and but that is how he originally spelled his name. His father was a business manager for the University of Mississippi, so he had a pretty rich Southern white childhood at the time period. Um, and despite all that, he dropped out of high school and began self-directed studies. Now, this time period, again, it's more acceptable and, you know, it's treated a little bit differently. But because his father was rich, he could really do those self-directed studies because once he knew how to read and read well and understand concepts, he could read any book you wanted on a topic. His father could pretty much get it for him. Other children who dropped out of school wouldn't have been able to educate themselves. His family background fueled his desire for military glory, and he also, a lot like Poe, found out that his sweetheart had become engaged to someone else, making him a jilted lover. So he tries to join the British Royal Air Force in Canada during World War One, but the war was over before he finished training, so he wasn't able to really get anywhere for that. So he returned to America. He decided to take some college courses, never really finished, but he eventually began writing and publishing. In 1925, he took a tour of Europe. He often um, was considered one of the lost generation, even though he didn't really associate with other writers of the lost generation. His first novel, Soldier's Pay from 1926, gives a Southern, though not a Mississippian setting. Um, a lot of his stories have a Southern setting, many have a Mississippi setting because that's, you write what you know. And it was an impressive achievement, stylistically ambitious, strongly evocative of the sense of alienation experienced by soldiers returning from World War One to the civilian world of which they seemed no longer a part. Which again, a, a lot of time this time period, people who were coming out of World War One, they are experiencing not just PTSD, but also you're trained to think differently, to act differently. How do you go back into a civilian world? This is something that men and women in the militaries around the world deal with today still, along with PTSD. He writes his second novel, Mosquitoes, in 1927, which launched a satirical attack on the New Orleans literary scene. Again, he avoided centers of literary talent in order to write. He despised working with other writers. So it was his way of kind of critiquing them, especially identifiable individuals. And it's really a declaration of artistic independence that he didn't need these other writers to do well. He had meanwhile written his guts, he claimed, into the more technically sophisticated The Sound and the Fury because he believed that it was fated to remain permanently unpublished. So he didn't need to make any concessions to the cautious commercialism of the literary marketplace. So this allowed him to really get his full meaning across, really practice his art. And it's one of his best novels. In 1929, the woman who originally broke his heart, now that she was no longer married, was free to marry him. So they get married in 29. In 1933, they have their daughter Jill, and they did have a troubled marriage, but they stayed together. And during the 1930s, he was trying to write, but you don't always make a lot of money in the beginning as a writer. So things that he was very good at, because he was good at writing, he was able to take screenwriting jobs. So there are a lot of early films in the 30s and 40s that if you look at who the screenwriter is, Faulkner actually wrote the story. Another famous novel that he uh, wrote is As I Lay Dying in 1930, and that's before his daughter's born. In the 1930s, he finally becomes famous, and mostly because of the screenwriting jobs, because of his first few novels. He's starting to pick up a little bit more cash at this time period. So he uses the money to buy a plane. He learns how to become a pilot. Um, he isn't really interested in World War II. He is a young kid at this time period, but he urges his brother Dean to become a pilot and then gave Dean the plane so that he could fly too. But when Dean crashed the plane and passed away, Faulkner felt very responsible for Dean's death because he felt like if I hadn't urged Dean to become a pilot, if I hadn't given him the plane, he wouldn't have died. And so when Dean's daughter was born a few months later in 1936, William made it his duty to provide for her education. So basically, Dean's daughter had the same upbringing and education as his own daughter Jill, and he paid for raising both daughters. Another famous story that came from this emotional turmoil was Absalom Absalom, written later in the year after his brother died. And then he also wrote Go Down Moses in 1942. He was very ambiguous about his race feelings. He did support the end of oppression, especially not just, he was born after slavery had ended, but during the Jim Crow era. So he didn't necessarily say, well, this is the way I feel that we should abolish Jim Crow era laws. He did say that no one should be oppressed, but he felt that if anyone was going to end it, it needed to be the South that ended it. It shouldn't be that the North forced the South to end their oppression and vice versa, that any oppression that was going on in the North, the South shouldn't be telling the North how to live their lives, that it's each individual area needed to learn for themselves how to end this oppressive lifestyle against African Americans and other minorities, especially because not just because, as a Southerner, he, very much of the mindset, I don't want these Yankees telling me what to do, but also it if the South only does things because the North told them to, then it would lead potentially to problems of people in the South never actually learning why they shouldn't be oppressive because they only did it because they were told to. So again, he was very ambiguous about his race feelings, but he really did feel that if things were to progress, it had to be each people in their own time figuring out what to do to stop this. Now, obviously, we know that's not always a good plan because if we wait for people to do something, they're never going to do it, and that just leads to further oppression. He eventually won the Nobel Prize, like I said, and this boosted his ego. So he started to become a little bit more freer about drinking and his extramarital affairs. When you already have a marriage that's not doing so well, and then you're kind of, well, I'm a famous writer, I can do what I want. And he was an ambassador working for the State Department. All of that just led to a foolish freedom to do what he wanted. He became writer in residence for University of Virginia in Charlottesville, so that allowed him to do more writing. And then eventually he passed away at 64 because of a heart attack. A lot of it due to his drinking, but he would also go drinking and then ride horses and then fall off the horse because he was drunk. And they believe that the impact of falling off the horse wasn't really good for his body. So in 1930, this is around the time that he writes As I Lay Dying. He writes A Rose for Emily. So I always like to start with this WTF Faulkner, because it's a very crazy story. It's one of the only stories that we read that is not in linear chronological plot. There's a lot of flashbacks, there's a lot of jumping around in the timeline, and it's murder, but it's from a woman, which, late 1800s, early 1900s, we wouldn't, I mean, not that women aren't capable of murder, but we wouldn't have thought of women capable of murder at this time period. But also that ending, and we'll come back to that ending and what it potentially means. So we'll come back to that ending. So the timeline is really tricky, and a lot of scholars have tried to put it together. We'll go over a little bit about some timelines that they've been able to come up with. But even then, it's still not entirely sure what exactly the timeline is. I want to talk about the point of view because this one gets people tripped up a lot of times. So it is first person point of view. However, it is plural. That's why it trips people up because they don't realize that we is first person plural. So it is a first person narrator. We get the unreliability, we get the um the normal parts of the story where, we only know what is being told to us by the narrator, and the narrator doesn't know everything. So it is definitely a first person point of view. It's just it's in first person because of it it first person plural because there's more than one alderman, and we're seeing it from the point of view of the alderman. Okay, so this is all part of what we call the Southern Gothic genre. So the Gothic genre is something that we talk about with Poe. I may not have mentioned it in the video, but his is part of the Gothic genre. Also, Frankenstein, that we'll read after poetry, is part of the Gothic genre. And a lot of Gothicism, it's not like goth, like emo and goth like we think of today. The Gothic is the late 16 to early 18, maybe even to early 1900s. And this genre includes irony, the macabre and grotesque, social issues, and violence. The difference with a Southern Gothic genre is that it will often include a Southern setting, decay, outsiders coming in, and slavery and race. And this is something that the Southern Gothic genre is unique to the United States, whereas the Gothic genre itself is something that is done both in America, like with Poe, and overseas, like we'll see with Mary Shelley. Okay, so the next part is our character. So the first part of our character is Miss Emily Grierson. So there's a few things that we can tell from that. The fact that they call her Miss means that, it's still a time period that we're saying, Miss and Mrs. and Mr. and even to the to young people that it's, Mr. Eric Grierson or Miss Emily Grierson or whoever it is as a sign of respect. But this is especially done with those of higher class status. The fact that it never changes from Miss. Throughout her life, she is always Miss Emily Grierson. Lets us know that she never married. She is always single, at least in the eyes of the aldermen. They will always see her as single because she never get married publicly. Toby is our manservant, so he is kind of a relic of slavery. He works willingly for the Grierson family, especially for Miss Emily, and he probably is, or hopefully is, paid, and but it's definitely a relic of slavery that they would have had a manservant of African American descent at the Grierson family home. Homer Barron is our kind of love interest for Miss Emily. We'll go a little bit more into pulling him apart in some ways in a little bit. Miss Emily's father, we don't really see him much. We get a little bit of his character in the fact of we know he was a Southern gentleman. He was definitely in not World War II, in the Civil War because he knew Colonel Sartoris. Now, interestingly, Colonel Sartoris that Emily refers to as having worked, fought with her father and basically said that their family didn't have to pay taxes anymore. There's no record of him that the later aldermen find. And the but it is again showing that her family was part of the South in the rebellion in the Civil War. The cousins are the outside family. So again, those outsiders coming in telling us what to do, but they're going to be of Southern descent as well. And it's more to protect the family. Again, we'll get more into that. And then the aldermen. There are actually two generations of aldermen throughout the story. And again, they're our narrator. Even though Miss Emily Grierson is the character who, the protagonist that we follow through the story, it is the aldermen who narrate the story. That makes it first person. And remember, we had said first person doesn't have to be the protagonist telling the story, it can be anyone telling the story, even if they're only partially related to the story. So, like I said, Miss Emily denotes that she never married, but it is a title nonetheless. Toby is the manservant, a token reminder of slavery. And Emily's father, besides, us knowing kind of that he has this beautiful house and that she clearly, at the beginning of the story with the death of her father, is, you know, a sign that she's not willing to easily let go of someone who's close to her. That lets us know that, some foreshadowing for what will happen later. But it goes to show that her father is also kind of a symbolic representation, almost like a kind of like a 3D, not 3D, a 2D flat character would be of the pre-Civil War South. Everything about him is of the pre-Civil War South. Everything about her is having to deal with the aftermath of the war and how the South was changing and have to change to keep up with it. The cousins are there in the story to remind Miss Emily of her place and status. So the man that she has been seen running around town with, Homer Barron, he is of new money. She is of old money. And it's technically classes, but he would be below her station. So if she were to marry him, it would be considered completely scandalous to, what would happen. So it's more likely that she is, the cousins are there to remind her, this is your station in life. You cannot marry a man who is of new money, whether he has money or not. He's beneath your station. And he's a Yankee on top of that. He's from the North, a carpetbagger. One of these people who saw opportunities in the South after the war and decided, I'll go in and change it, and puts everything he owns in a carpet bag and goes down to make his fortunes off of the South. So again, it's this idea of the scandal if she were to marry him. So the cousins are there to kind of prevent her from marrying him. And after they go away, she kind of goes into her house and he's definitely not seen again. She's not seen again for a while. The aldermen, as I said, there are two generations of aldermen in the story. The initial ones are the ones who are there describing the story with her father and what happened right after Emily and Homer's story takes place. Now, because of all the jumping around, it's not easy to tell when the first generation takes over from, or the second generation takes over from the first, but there definitely are different people because their first generation never go to her about about her taxes. The second generation goes to collect taxes from her, has no record of Cardinal Sartorus, which there wouldn't have been a record. Everyone in the town would have known who Colonel Sartorus was, and they clearly don't know everything from Miss Emily. Now, the first generation, like I said, after Homer Barron goes missing, is when the weird smell starts happening around the house that people complain about. And rather than investigate what that weird smell is, they just go out in the middle of the night, put some lime around the house, solves the smell, nobody complains. Nobody investigates further into what's going on with Emily. So this makes the question that if this murder took place of Homer Barron, does that make them complicit? Because they knew something was wrong. And many of the aldermen, too, probably would have served in the war. They would have known what a dead body would smell like. So why did they not investigate further, especially when this northerner goes missing? Now, it could be because they didn't really agree with the northerner either. And they're like, hey, if he's dead, whatever, it doesn't matter. But again, does that make them all complicit because they didn't investigate in the murder? All right. Homer himself has a lot to him, so we'll get started. Homer, his first name is the same as the writer of the Odyssey and the Iliad stories, which did not end well for most people. Now, it's interesting because the poet Homer, who wrote the Odyssey and the Iliad, actually is not considered by scholars to be one person. We consider it one person because, the ancient manuscripts we found were the Odyssey by Homer or the Iliad by Homer. And there are not many. There are some accounts of him being a blind poet, but the stories themselves, the way they're written, have different voices in them, different styles of writing, even. So it's more likely that it was compiled by multiple people, maybe choosing one of those people as the main author, maybe making up a story. We don't know. But so the fact that Homer represents this writer when it's really multiple people representing this one thing, that's an interesting of reference kind of to the alderman representing this one person point of view, first person point of view, but it also represents that Homer is kind of a flat 2D character. He's just another Yankee carpetbagger from the north who comes down to make his fortune. He's not well rounded. Baron, the name, if we spell it with one R, is the title of nobility in British and European nobility. So it's an interesting that even though he's of new money, his name makes it sound like he's of old money. But also there's a homonym, Baron, Barren, meaning without life. So those are some uh foreshadowing just from his name that some scholars have seen that really show this was not a story that was going to end out well for him. But also, some scholars have picked up the line Homer himself had remarked he liked men. And some students and scholars take this to mean Homer was a homosexual. And this could represent a different motive for his murder. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, obviously it was still illegal to be homosexual. It was punishable by death, or and that's if the law got involved, if people didn't kill someone just because they were homosexual in the first place. So this could mean that maybe Emily didn't kill him to prevent becoming a jilted lover, which is what many people see as the motive for her murder, was that he was seen all around town. She thought he was going to marry her. And then when it looked like he wasn't going to marry her, either because of the cousin's influence or something else, that she would have become a jilted lover. It would have made her look bad that maybe it was that reason she killed him. Or maybe it was to protect him before someone else could hurt him for being gay. Maybe it was because she was jealous of whom his true lovers might be when she found out. There's many, 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 many possibilities. Now, we don't know of anything in Faulkner's life that would influence him to write an LGBTQ character, but again, whether the author intended that interpretation or not, if the text supports the interpretation, then it could be interpreted that way, as long as you can make the argument from the text. Now, it could be just he liked men, as in he liked the company of men better than women, but it was known. I mean, Oscar Wilde was a known flamboyant homosexual of the late 1800s, early 1900s. So there were people who knew of the famous trial of Oscar Wilde, um, even a famous trial in um, Faulkner's own lifetime. It was after this is written, but we have the story of Alan Turing, who helped crack the Nazi code with the Enigma machine. When later they found out he was gay, he was put in prison and chemically castrated. So, and that was, he hadn't done anything wrong but be gay. So it wasn't a secret that people were gay at this time period. So it's possible that he could have written a gay character, but it's also possible that he didn't, and that we are able to interpret this line that could lead to a very different modern day interpretation of the story. Some themes from the story: isolation. She's kept in the house by the fact that she doesn't really like other people, by the way that she doesn't really associate with other people. Part of that could be class wise, part of that could be um, that she prefers to be alone. Part of it could be, clearly she has her own company with the body. Um, a big theme of memory and the past, and that, there's a difference between being able to have memories of the past and letting go of the past to be able to move forward, and just holding on to the memories, not the physical incarnation of the memories. Also, as part of being a vision of America, this is a great way to show how the world was changing very quickly. And if you didn't keep up with it, you were left behind. And that's, not always a good thing, but in this case, it was a good thing for many people with consequences for individuals sometimes. And that memory, she's holding on to the memory of the past, thinking that if she keeps living the way she did in the past, it will go back to being the way it was in the past, when the past was gone and it needed to move forward. Also, versions of reality. We talked about this with other stories, but it's big in this part because we're getting a first person narrator who's not intricately involved with the story. So, what is reality and what is not reality is a big question. We never know what the motive was. We never know if Miss Emily is the one who killed Homer. We don't even know for sure that it's Homer's skeleton in the bed. We assume that it is based on the clues in that room. We assume it was Miss Emily, again, based on the way that she acted. It could have been Toby who killed for his mistress, so that way she would be safe. There are many, many motives. It could have been that Toby and Emily had a thing for each other, but she couldn't be seen with him. So, being the jilted lover was the easier story. Um, Compassion and forgiveness. You know, they had compassion for her and tried to forgive her, for being part of the past and not being willing to take on the future. And also, there might be some compassion and forgiveness potential in um, Emily's story as a murderess. Some symbolism. The house itself, again, we said is a symbolism of her um, father and his past. It is also falling apart. She doesn't keep very good care of it throughout her lifetime. But a lot of that could be because, she didn't have the money anymore. It could be that she didn't care as much about outside appearances anymore. Um, but it's really a great representation of, this old house from the pre-Civil War South is falling apart, just like how the old South was falling apart, slowly making way into what would eventually become, fighting for civil rights into what would become today. And, we've come a long way with in some manners. The pocket watch and stationery and hair. The pocket watch usually would have been a wedding present. So the fact that she had a pocket watch on the table for him. The stationery, probably to write out thank you letters for those who had come to a potential wedding. The entire room that they find when they break open the attic, it's like a wedding that never happened, the wedding day that should have happened. The hair on the pillow, that's where people really start to wonder, because you wonder, people automatically think, well, there's hair on the pillow. Maybe it, got put there, and maybe they were scandalous and they had slept together before the potential marriage. And then when he left her, she killed him. But it's a gray hair. So that symbolizes that someone who was older was sleeping in that bed. And anyone who knows enough biology would know that hair is going to disintegrate fast enough that if it were something that, like, her father used to sleep in that bed, and then that's where she put the skeleton and made it into a wedding uh shrine in that room, it would have already disintegrated if it were her father's. And the only person in that entire house who had grown old, who would have been sleeping there, would have been her. So it's creepy and disgusting thought that she would be sleeping with this dead body beside her. But considering she wasn't willing to give up her father's body to be buried, it shows again she clearly cannot let go of the past and and just appreciate the memories from it, even in the murder itself. Um, the death and taxes, these are two things that, it's a famous phrase that we can guarantee two things in life above all else, death and taxes. And in this story, we have death of Miss Emily, her own inevitable death. Um, Obviously, we have death in a murder sort of way, but also the fact of taxes were guaranteed, that even though she was originally grandfathered under the same premise as her father from Colonel Sartoris, that she didn't have to pay taxes, inevitably it caught up with her, and that's where the younger aldermen started asking questions about the taxes. Now, clearly, they didn't start asking a bunch of questions, and there wasn't a lot written down from the previous aldermen, so they didn't really know to investigate, but they knew she was a cryptic person and that she was a very curious person, because they're one of the first ones to lead the charge to break open her room after the funeral. And then lastly, this is an approximate timeline that scholars have put together. You can ignore the specific years if you want to and just follow the timeline itself. The years are just an approximation of what might be going on, but we don't know for sure based on the setting. And again, this is still to be determined by scholars, because there's a lot of details that they make sense in certain places if you were to put the story in a certain order, like this order, but people can argue for other orders of the story. It just depends. So some people believe Miss Emily Grierson is born during the Civil War, and that just past the Civil War, the Grierson house is built. Eventually, in the 1890s, Miss Emily's father dies, and then she falls ill because of her father's death. Her taxes are remitted in December, and she's been kind of sticking to herself. She's still in mourning. She's still kind of ill. She, in the summer of 1894, meets Homer Barron during the late fall into the next summer, is when possibly the cousins have come to talk her out of marrying Homer Barron. And 1895, at some point, Homer is last seen entering Miss Emily's house. And by this time, scholars calculate that she's over 30 and that they use 33 for their calculations to make it a little bit easier. In 1895, after Homer is last seen entering, the townspeople become concerned about the smell of the house, and the aldermen sprinkle lime around Emily's house to try to help with the smell. Then she stays inside for 6 months, and then sometime between 1895 and 1898, she emerges. Her hair is gradually turning gray. So this would fit with the being in the late 30s, but it would also fit with the, oh, she's turning gray because of great heartache and illness. In 1899, she stopped opening her door, doesn't leave the house for about 5 years. And then she emerges in 1904, about 5 years later, to start giving China painting lessons for about 7 years. And then she stopped giving painting lessons, and over the 10 years pass before she has any contact with the town. And then around 1925, the newer generation comes to ask about the taxes. This is 30 years after the business with the lime, and this is the last contact she has with the town before her death. And then, they kind of leave her alone for a while, and she dies at 74 years old. Toby leaves the house. 2 days later, the funeral is held at the Grierson home, and at the funeral is when the townspeople break down the door to the bridal chamber / crypt, which no one has seen in 40 years. So finally, last part with the tone, the alderman, it is a very interesting, ironic tone because we think everything's kind of okay, and then you get that irony of, oh, everything was definitely not okay at the end. But also the title. There's a rose in the title, but none in the story. And this is very symbolic of the fact that a rose is beautiful, yet full of thorns. So if we want to think of Emily as the jilted lover, the murderer, or murderess in this case, she's a beautiful rose, but you do not mess with a rose because it is still full of thorns. So I hope this helps so you can understand this crazy nonlinear plot a little bit better. And we'll come back with more short stories that we'll discuss in order to prepare for the short story exam and get ready for poetry.